Hey everyone, and this is in regards to Meet the Press by Chuck Todd. And as you know, he's MSNBC. Of course, we all recognize they're very, very left leaning. And here, they haven't swayed from that in any way. But it's in regards to an interview that Chuck Todd had with a couple gentlemen, one from the Southern Poverty Law Center and the other this Mark Bray character that's an author of Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook, that's a lecturer at Dartmouth College. But at the very least, I'm seeing, at least in regards to Chuck Todd here, and like I say, I'm not giving the guy no free pass. We seen he's a very, very much a political opportunist. But the Americans are much better at doing things than Canadians, and I can't stand the fact that the Canadian establishment wants to take all the, they want to put forth and present some kind of narrative or dialogue that's akin or in association with some of their peers or counterparts in the U.S., but they want to do it in their own particular way. And let me just say that in Canada, that particular way is it's just such a failure. And if you don't know that instinctively, then just recognize the fact that all of the successful Canadians have had to go through the U.S. to achieve their success, right? Whether it's hockey players or people in professional sports, actors, comedians, right? Artists, business leaders, tech gurus, executives, intellectual leaders, philosophical, doctors, they all go to the U.S. If you want to achieve any or attain any amount of success in your particular venture or endeavor, most Canadians recognize that, yeah, that's not going to happen very well in this country unless you're willing to go along and get along with the political / ruling class. And here, once again, we're seeing as much as, like I say, I'm not a defender of a lot of the establishment in the U.S., but they do things in a much better way than you would if this was CBC News, right? And we know this because it was the Current that brought this Mark Bray, this author of the Antifa Handbook, right? This Dartmouth College lecturer, brought him onto their program. But it's like just lobbing pure softballs and no counter narrative at all. So complete proof positive once again that there's nothing even remotely objective as far as the kind of journalism that happens in the Canadian establishment media. At least in the U.S., they'll at least, and I mean, let's face it here, if you know anything too about politics and which side of the political spectrum that people from the Southern Poverty Law Center would be, they're predominantly leftists, right? Liberals or progressives, but definitely left, right? So it's not like Chuck Todd brought an objectivist or a conservative or a Republican in to rebut the kind of narrative that this Mark Bray put forth, which is promoting violence, right? Against speech, because this is all in regards to speech, because every human being on the planet that I've ever spoke to is completely in line as far as, yeah, of course, if someone's using violence against you, yes, you have every bit of a right to use violence against them to defend yourself. So nobody that I've ever met would say, no, that's not. So, like I say, this is political narrative predominantly. But I at least want to play this. It's not that long, okay? It's about a 5-minute clip, but I at least want to play it to show you that at the very least, the U.S. media will at least give someone, even though they are still on the same side politically, but at least they'll at least set forth a counter narrative, right? Even though it's still functioning somewhat of an echo chamber, but at least they're willing to put forth and present an alternative dialogue and an alternative narrative. I will read the headline and the caption in this particular video, but from Meet the Press, it's, "Is violence ever acceptable in the face of hate groups?" So, in the face of hate groups, so it's not in retaliation to using violence against other people. It's just in people that are speaking in things that you may deem as being hate groups, but they're still just using speech. Speech, people, it's speech. So what the real question is, should you ever use violence against speech, right? And of course, any decent human being should first and foremost say no. the proper answer, the proper rebuttal to supposed hate speech, and that's another thing. But in the U.S., the Supreme Court in the United States even recognized that there's no such thing as hate speech. It's protected speech, no matter how you want to paint it, right, politically. But of course, if someone's just putting forth speech, just words, right, that can harm you. Remember that thing that you were told when you were a young kid? Sticks and stones may break your bones, but nails will never hurt you, right? If it's just speech, that can't harm you. Richard Cohen, president of the Southern Poverty Law Center, and Mark Bray, author of Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook, debate the tactics used by white nationalists counter protesters. So just listen to this 5-minute segment, and we'll get back to covering any premises or rebuttals put forward and presented, right?
Welcome back. I'm joined now by two gentlemen with very different views on how to respond to white supremacists when they take to the streets. Mark Bray is a Dartmouth professor who has studied the Antifa anti-fascist movement. Antifa is a far-left political movement that argues it's necessary to confront hate groups, sometimes with force. Professor Bray is author of the new book, Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook. And Richard Cohen is the president of the Southern Poverty Law Center as an expert in hate groups, and he says direct confrontation simply leads to more of the kind of violence we saw in Charlottesville. Gentlemen, welcome to you both. I'm going to try to have this sort of debatey, so Mark Bray, I'll start with you. You seem to be a very small minority here who is defending the idea of violence, considering that somebody died in Charlottesville. Why do you defend confronting in a violent way?
Well, first, I would contest the notion that I'm that small of a minority. I think that a lot of people recognize that when pushed, self-defense is a legitimate response to white supremacist and neo-Nazi violence. And, you know, we've tried ignoring neo-Nazis in the past. We've seen how that turned out in the 20s and 30s. And the lesson of history is you need to take it with the utmost seriousness before it's too late. We've seen the millions of deaths that have come from not taking it seriously enough. And we can see that really the way that white supremacy grows, the way that neo-Nazism grows is by becoming legitimate, becoming established, becoming everyday, family-friendly, wear khakis instead of hoods. And the way to stop that is what people did in Boston, what people did in Charlottesville. Pull the emergency brake and say, you can't make this normal.
Richard, why do you believe this is a mistake?
I think it's a spectacularly bad idea to give one group of people the right to silence another group of people. It's contrary to our values embodied in the First Amendment. It's likely to drive the people who are trying to censor underground, where they may resort to illegal means to express themselves, like bombs. And lastly, it's likely to lead to a terrible spiral. We saw that in Berkeley. The Antifa came and shut down a speech. The next time, the white nationalists brought their own private army. And so, you know, where does something like that stop? Yesterday in Boston, you know, when we saw thousands and thousands of people peacefully protest, that seemed like a much stronger answer to white supremacy than clubs and guns.
Andy Young made the point, Mark, earlier in the show, that essentially there were those in the civil rights movement that wanted to confront violently, and he made the not-so-subtle reminder, they're not here anymore.
Well, there's a big difference between confronting fascism and confronting other forms of violence. So we can see that during the 30s and 40s, there was no public opinion to be leveraged by nonviolent resistance. If you get fascists to be powerful enough in government, they're simply not going to listen to the kind of public opinion that nonviolence can generate. That's the argument for resistance to Nazis. And the other point that I'll make is that a lot of people don't have the choice whether they can defend themselves or not. We've seen that even before this sort of, as you called it, spiral of violence started, there were attacks on mosques, there were attacks on synagogues. A lot of people are under attack, and sometimes they need to be able to defend themselves. It's not, you know, it's a privileged position to be able to say that you never have to defend yourself from these kinds of monsters.
You know, it's not an issue of defending yourself. It's an issue of trying to silence other people. No one is saying that, you know, if you're slugged in the face that you have to sit there and take it. The question here is when white nationalists want to walk down the street, should people stop them? And that's a very different issue. It's a very peculiar notion of self-defense to say you can censor people.
Some of the criticism of the Antifa movement, Mark, is that you're actually against speech, that you want to shut down this speech, and that borders on censorship.
Well, let's be clear that Antifa are not calling on the government to censor anyone. In fact, that they resist the notion of turning to the government or turning to the police, who we've seen have been infiltrated by white supremacists, who have been sympathetic to the court sort of return to law and order notion of fascism. And so the idea is the real enemies of free speech are fascists. We've seen that historically. We've seen that they're the ones that, if they have their way, will shut down speech. And it also differs in the sense that anti-fascists see this as a political struggle. They don't see fascism as a difference of opinion or as kind of a different perspective to consider. Instead, they see fascists as the enemy, and I think that we need to come around to that notion, considering that there is no doubt what they've done historically.
Richard, I know the concern is that it makes martyrs out of the white supremacists.
Yes.
And it makes it, I mean, look, it drove one could argue that the Antifa movement helped the president make his arguments of, quote, both sides.
Sure.
Do you buy that?
Well, look, to some degree, there was a lot of ugliness that the Antifa brought there, and I think they play into the hands of the white nationalists who say, "Look, we're the ones who are embattled." The answer to bad speech is more speech. We saw it in Boston yesterday.
Well, we've seen that fail historically. I mean, fascism cannot be defeated through speech. And we can also see that, Charlottesville did give attention to white supremacy, but it's not as if your average American can name any of the groups that were out there. Instead, we can see that they were unable to do the things that we see make movements grow, embed themselves in communities, establish networks, express their message. Instead, we see, and I can tell you from my book, from my research, there's a lot of empirical examples historically of anti-fascism working and stopping these groups from growing.
All right, Mark Bray, Richard Cohen, I got to leave it there. I imagine, though, the debate doesn't stop here. Thank you both for coming on.
So as you're hearing, and I mean, I'm completely in agreement with this gentleman from the Southern Poverty Law Center in regards to the fact that, yes, I mean, this Mark Bray is trying to put forth the kind of dialogue, the kind of narrative that suggests that, yes, you can use violence to suppress people, and it can work. Well, of course it can, right? If you keep punching the shit out of people, you might prevent that particular person from speaking up because you force them into submission, so to speak, right? But all you've done is embolden the people that care about that person to be against you and to have a larger show of force in opposition to what you put forth and present because you used violence or force as a means to end. So they're like, well, I guess we should race down to meet them. If they don't want to listen to our words or our rhetoric or what we have to say, well, hey, they're telling us that violence is the means to an end. These are people that on a person-by-person, on a case-by-case basis, you will see that if you challenge them, well, there's a very good reason. And like I say, I'm not picking sides here. I got no horse in the race. But there's a very good reason that a very small country in Europe called Germany had the capacity and the willingness and the audacity to challenge basically the rest of the world, right? And they almost succeeded. Or at least they dragged it out for 6 fucking years? And how many millions of people died, right? So, you can go against them. But they are the kind of people that, they're quite competitive in nature, right? They have their own ideological preferences, but they are more than willing and seem very capable to carry out the kind of violence that this Mark Bray puts forth and presents. So if you want to put forth and present the narrative that violence is okay as a means to an end, then you really should be looking to the people you're opposing to realize that, fuck, if they bring violence to the table, they can bring it to a level that, well, as we've seen, has never been brought forth or presented historically. And when it has happened, holy shit. Yeah, you can expect a whole lot of death and destruction as a consequence, as a result of that race to the bottom. It's Canadian Libertarian, and I love liberty.